Everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening for our panel discussion about functional communication plans. I am Maria Ott, and I'm a member of the X-Minds board. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, we are a volunteer-driven nonprofit whose mission is to improve education for students on the autism spectrum. And we are based in Montgomery County, Maryland. You can find out more about us at our website, xminds.org, where we have a wealth of resources and information. Also, regular online speaker events like this one is another way X-Minds reaches out to the community. So I want to make sure everyone is aware of our November 18th panel discussion on a very important topic: options for decision-making when my child on the spectrum turns 18. So turning back to today, before introducing our excellent panelists, I wanted to share a few brief points with you since this is my first opportunity to speak with you directly, both as a member of the X-Minds board and as founder and chair of the Non-Speaking Autistic Students Committee. This committee was envisioned due to X-Minds' observation for the imperative to have a more robust and proactive discussion about the needs, abilities, and rights of non-speakers. Recently, we added a webpage to the X-Minds website dedicated to resources on the non-speaking community. Many of those resources were written by actual non-speakers, which I personally find refreshing and encouraging as the mother of a non-speaker myself. If you haven't already, we encourage you to check it out. It cannot be overstated that without an effective means of communication, non and minimally speaking students are being deprived of their ability to fully and maximally express their thoughts, their feelings, what they understand and to what extent they understand, what they yearn to know, to do, to experience, and so much more of what those of us who rely on speech as our primary form of communication take for granted every day. Indeed, communication is a human right. Our very own Maryland State Department of Education's website states the following: communication is a basic human right. If a student does not have a consistent, understandable, and reliable form of communication, it is essential that school staff work with the student and family to develop a communication system for the student to use daily and across all environments. So the purpose of today's event is really twofold. The first is to explore how to work with the school system to prioritize creating, maintaining, and growing a communication plan for students who need them to be able to access the curriculum and lead independent, fulfilling lives to their fullest potential. There is no official term for such a plan, but different iterations have been thrown around informally by educators, therapists, etc., one of which is functional communication plan. The second purpose of tonight's event is to hopefully begin a dialogue about the needs of persons who do not rely on speech as their primary form of communication. X-Minds plans to hold many more panel events focusing on issues affecting this community and hopes to include a non-speaker at each of those events so we can hear from these experts and learn from their incredible stories. Finally, there are varying schools of thought on the education, the abilities, and the potential of non-speakers. And through these events, X-Minds hopes to serve as a forum for open dialogue. Various methodologies and therapies will inevitably arise during these open discussions. Though X-Minds encourages robust discussion and respect for the expertise of all our panelists, we do not endorse any one method in particular. We do, however, endorse the point of view that the presumption of competence is the fundamental starting point of any conversation concerning and with the non-speaking community. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our excellent panelists who will shed some light on what a functional communication plan is, how it can be implemented effectively in an educational setting, and their own experience on the receiving end of this tool. There will be a Q&A after all three panelists have made their presentations. Our first panelist is speech-language pathologist Leslie Fontana of the Children's Spot of Maryland, followed by Dr. Paul Lavelli, educational consultant at Kids First, and then Joy Johnson, who is herself autistic, a behavior specialist, inclusion specialist, autism advocate, and founder of Spectrum Support. Without further ado, Leslie, please take it away.
Thanks, Maria. All right. Hi, all. My name is Leslie, and I'm a speech language pathologist, as Maria said. So I'm currently working for a private practice in Columbia, Maryland, and I am recently new to Maryland. I just moved here 2 years ago from Virginia. A few things. I'm the first to speak tonight, so no pressure. I'm not tech savvy, so I've been doing teletherapy since March and having to get pretty savvy fast, but I'm used to seeing my audience, so I can look for sleeping people to modify my language and quizzical glances. And since I can't see you, please save your questions for me. I am totally open to answering them, and my email's at the end, so you can email me with questions. Since this is such a brief overview tonight, you may actually walk away with several other things to research, actually. So next slide, please, Melissa. All right, so the topic today that was presented to me so that I could speak on it was a development of a quality communication plan that's functional, and then ways to foster collaboration from multiple parties. And this is really envisioned by, even though it's not a formal term, envisioned by a parent. And I know many of my parents feel this way, that there's somewhat of a gap in moving towards a functional communication plan that crosses all settings. So hopefully you gather some information tonight that you can take back to your therapy teams that might help you develop one. All right, next slide, Melissa. All right, so these were the questions that were posed to me, and hopefully I'll do my best to answer them. Who initiates a communication plan? Who creates a communication plan? What is its purpose? What are the components? When does a parent ask for this? And how does one know whether their child could benefit from a communication plan that's functional? Next slide. All right, so a functional communication plan, which is the title of tonight's panel. What is it? So if it's not a formal term, nor is it a legal document, I consider this as a speech language pathologist to be best practice in programming for a child with limited communication skills. And ideally, I envision this as a plan that crosses settings, school, home, and community. And this sounds like common sense, but it is much harder in practice. I have worked in the pediatric hospital setting, in private practice and clinics. I've worked in the public schools and also in the home setting. And when you're in those settings with professionals, it is best practice to try and cross over settings, but it is a lot harder to actually do that. So ideally, I would want this plan to require an interdisciplinary collaborative model where the providers, the specialists, are actually creating and doing the assessments together, creating the plan together, creating the goals together. And I would want this to be functional and naturalistic. So throughout your day, throughout the child's day, and then to allow for multiple trials of practice. Next slide, Melissa. So a purpose. I was asked what a purpose of this could be. A purpose of a collaborative communication plan would be to provide a measurable way to generalize skills to all settings. Next slide. All right, so terminology. If it's not a formal term, how do we get our needs met? So each setting has its own terminology, and these things are legal documents. So the question is, how do we do a communication plan that's functional within these legal documents, and what roles do the providers play? And so as an SLP, I have actually, created individualized education plans in the school. I have created individualized family service plans in that home and birth to 3 early intervention setting. And I have definitely created lots and lots of plans of care, individual treatment plans in the hospital or clinic setting. So I'm going to go on to talk about what role a speech language pathologist would play in building in a functional plan within this legal document. All right, Melissa. So clearly this is my favorite, the SLP's role. How do you build a functional communication plan? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we study as speech pathologists, because I think that's actually very confusing. It's changed over 50 years. So we go to undergraduate in communication sciences, and then we are required to have a graduate degree, although a lot of us are getting PhDs. in communication science. And basically what we're studying is the anatomy and physiology of the feeding and speech system and feeding system. And then on top of that, the neuroanatomy and the brain, which is in control of language. So that's expressive language, so talking and the content behind that. And then also receptive language, which is comprehension from birth all the way to the end of life. And then how that impacts and leads to literacy. And literacy would encompass reading decoding, so learning to read like syllable patterns and phonemes, and then as well as reading comprehension, spelling, and written language. So the SLP is the expert in the area of communication. And then when you want them to help you create a communication plan for a child that's emergent verbal or nonverbal, which is primarily what my patients are currently, you definitely want an SLP who has experience with children that are emergent verbal or nonverbal. So not all of us specialize in the same thing, and you definitely want to ask them what they specialize in and know that you have someone that's looking out for you in this area. So their role is determining what mode or method of functional communication is most appropriate for that individual. So taking everything they've learned and then taking in your child as an individual and figuring that out and analyzing that for you. And establishing an appropriate expectation regarding speech and language development. So for example, if I have an occupational therapist working with me and she's targeting something and she asks me, you know, can I target who questions or can I target this? Is my responsibility to help her know what language, where that child's baseline is, and then where I want that child to go so she can also help me target that. All right, Melissa, next slide. So the occupational therapist is so closely related to building a functional communication plan. I need them. They're usually in the hospital setting with me. They're in the school setting with me. They're in the home setting with me. I need them to take a child that is emergent verbal or nonverbal and then look at it from a different perspective, a fine motor perspective, take into visual motor integration. How does that go with tracking and using their hands, what their motor planning strengths and weaknesses are, and then determine with me how that affects the child's ability to access that communication system. And their job is to collaborate with me and other service providers, depending on the setting, and to build that communication plan so that it's functional across settings. All right, Melissa, next slide, please. All right, so a team approach. When I was doing IEPs, it depended on what team I had, but a lot of times it was multidisciplinary. And that seems also like common sense, but what it usually means by accident is that the special education teacher is writing goals and doing her assessment on her own. And the speech language pathologist might be assessing and doing her plan on her own. And the occupational therapist is doing his or her assessment and then on their own, and then putting it all together in a document called an IEP. And they haven't necessarily sat down and done it together. Now, an interdisciplinary collaboration approach, which I have used in the schools and in the home setting and the outpatient, is when we all sit down together and collaborate and communicate for the assessment, for the goal setting, and then for the intervention plan. And that makes a huge difference because then everything's connected. The OT's fine motor goals and motor planning goals are related to my speech and language, and my speech and language is related to the special education teacher's content. And then we're discussing and sharing those perspectives and hashing that out to identify the priorities. And, you know, we have different intervention priorities, but as a team, then we're building that into a functional communication plan for you as a family. And then the goal is to provide less fragmentation of services, which I know you as parents sometimes feel that it can be very fragmented among settings. All right, Melissa. All right, so the SLP's role, the infrastructure for a communication plan. So at this point, you have your assessments, you've come to the table, you might have occupational therapy assessments, and you might have behavior assessments and special education teacher assessments, neuropsychology assessments. And you're going to take all that data, including probably a full augmentative alternative communication assessment, which is usually done by an AAC specialist. And that person is usually a speech language pathologist like myself, or an occupational therapist, or both. A lot of times we're working together. And you need your SLP to analyze your child's day. So I would be looking at pre-intentional behavior. So how does your child communicate when he or she's hungry or sleepy? How is she or he using intentional behavior? So that would be like eye gaze, facial expressions, and body movements. How you would use unconventional and conventional communication in all settings. Concrete symbol usage would be like when the object is actually representative of what it is. So maybe like a shoelace for a shoe. Abstract symbol usage is Braille or printed words, speech, manual signs, so many different systems. And then language usage is finally throughout the child's day, 2 to 3 word utterances. And then I would identify, where's our baseline data with this? And then I would need to identify that system that allows a child to do the following. So how could I, throughout the day, work with you as a family and with the other providers to have the child be able to refuse, obtain, use that for social purposes, and gain information? And then you would also want an analysis of speech production skills, because often there's a combination approach of using different things of the child's strengths and weaknesses. And then information about the family's schedule, the family's communication priorities, very important, and the environment. So again, just to be clear, you already kind of have your assessments, and this is step 2. This is how do I make a plan that's really functional that can help me as a family, help the child meet their goals across all settings. All right, Melissa. So the components of a communication plan, and this is my favorite because this is what I do all day. But the components are a communication system, and this is a whole nother talk, because that would be a talk about an augmentative alternative communication system or an assessment to get to that system. But a system would include vocalizations and approximations, so that's speech, maybe sign language, gestures, or modified signs, a non-speech generating devices like low technology boards. I use those all day long. Picture pointing boards, letter boards, text boards, picture exchange communication system. So I'm advanced trained in PECS, and many of you have probably heard of that with the exchange. That's also considered a communication system. A recent one from Australia is pragmatic organization dynamic displays. And again, if you have questions, you can email me at the end and I can tell you more about these things. And then finally, speech generating devices. So first you need the system to build the plan. Then you need core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary. And that is, what targets do we do? What is most functional to this family? So core vocabulary there's so much research behind it. It is basically all of the most frequently used words from birth to end of life. And, 20, 25 years ago, we used to talk about using words like cookie or apple. This is about using, when we were researching it, we realized that a lot of times it's saying apple instead of saying apple or cookie. A lot of people just say, I want that, and then use a gesture to specify. And so one needs to balance that using functional communication plus fringe vocabulary. And fringe vocabulary are the nouns like cookie or apple. And often those are built in, fringe vocabulary, into systems like picture exchange communication system. And the balance between core and fringe completely depends on your child and what language development, what baseline they are currently. So just a little more about fringe. You would maybe stay on fringe vocabulary for a time to establish communicative intent and cause and effect, and then move away from fringe and more into core. And then again, that's a discussion that you want to have with your team. Naturalistic aided language stimulation is so important. So I put these 3 terms because these are official terms and you might hear them. Sometimes it's called modeling, sometimes it's called partner augmented input, but basically the training to all the providers and the caregivers is about the communication system, the core and fringe, and the natural aided language stimulation. And this is basically non-contingent modeling where you're using the device. So if I had my device on the iPad, I would actually be talking and using it simultaneously to model. And the research is coming because typically developing children that are verbal, they have years and years of us getting down on their eye level and saying things with verbalizations and paired with gestures and telling them about things. And then often what happens is that a child gets a device or a communication system, and then they're just handed the system, and there's not that amount of time and development into that plan. And that child deserves as much time on this, learning and hearing the words without being expected to do it, but just all day long talking with it, reading books with it, using it when you're brushing their teeth, using it when you're toilet training. And that's one of the biggest things. I had a little note to myself to say an anecdote, but I've been in this clinic where I work for 2 years. So I have many of the same patients. And when COVID hit in March, I moved to teletherapy. And so it was a big lesson to me, which I already knew, but I had been spending a year and a half in the clinic with my families, teaching them about their AAC devices and their communication systems, giving homework, teaching them about speech cueing. And then I got to the telehealth and I watched them in their home and I realized, oh my goodness, they're not using it to talk all the time. They're not speech cueing when they should be. And so it's been about 9 months, and I can say my families are amazing. It's taken us a while, but it just really showed to me again how important it is to train all of the providers and caregivers, because it might seem intuitive, but it's not always intuitive, and it's something that's vital to an emergent verbal or a nonverbal speaker getting to have words, which, as Maria said, is a right. So, all right, Melissa, next slide. All right, so training. There's been a lot of research lately in how to implement a communication plan that's functional. And so one of the things is to make a written plan for implementing this system and then fading supports. And a prompt hierarchy is something that would be developed by your team, so that if your child was, for instance, let's say you were working on using the AAC device to talk, a prompt hierarchy would be where maybe you first give them a verbal cue without a gesture and you wait. And then you use a gestural cue and you wait. And then if they don't do it, maybe you model. And this prompt hierarchy would be developed by your team. But it's a really important way of fading back your prompt so the child starts initiating rather than being prompt dependent. You would want it written and established with conjunction with the SLP and OT. Now, I have written this kind of plan. Again, it's not a legal document, but I have written this kind of plan in the school system. I've sat down with the behavioral specialist and the OT and the PT and the special ed teacher and the psychologist, and sat down and written one of these to send home with families so that they really feel like what I'm working on at school is transferring, and then what I'm working on at the clinic is transferring. And then this is disseminated along with a meeting where we review the plan. And then I like to have monthly communication between my team, because I think that's really important as it's implemented. Because as it's implemented, you might change things. Some things might not work. You might trial it. You might change it. Maybe you change the prompt hierarchy, but you need to have constant communication with your team. Thanks. All right, so this is my my verbose slide, which I purposely made super wordy. So if you wanted a copy of the slide, you could just take it with you. But training has been there's been a lot of research in this basically. So on the bottom, I have 8-step instructional model by Bodden Center. This is one of the newer instructional models for training staff in schools or providers and caregivers. But one of the big things, and this is a personal anecdotal experience, having come from a school system, I feel like we do a really good job of making the plan, of making the IEP, of then maybe sitting down and developing a plan, and then maybe even do a really good job of modeling for the family and staff on how to use the system, which can be done in person or video. But what really gets lost then is then going back and observing the family and staff on how to use that system, and then providing feedback. So in the research, those two things have become really important: observing and then providing feedback. So you would want your SLP and your OT probably to either do in person, and I think teletherapy has been life-changing for this, to be able to actually have trained them and then go back and observe how are they implementing what I taught them, and then change that based on my feedback. So an SLP's job would be to provide activities with specific vocabulary targets with using vocabulary in multiple ways. And I have a few examples at the end of this session that I'll show you that I've just created in the clinic. But one of the most important things I think is training the paraeducators and writing that into the IEP. Training them in prompt fading, how to provide multiple opportunities for targets, training in aided language stimulation, training in concepts of vocabulary being targeted. They are with your child all day long, 5 days a week. And what I've noticed, both coming from the school system and in the outpatient setting, is that often I will have trained them and then I come back in and I'm like, oh, we need to shift that again. Let's go over that again. Let's make sure that you've got this part and you're using it to talk all day long, especially in transitions, maybe in the cafeteria. Like those are the times that are really important. Your special education teacher is usually trained as the lead because they tend to be the case manager of the IEP. They're collaborating with me, the SLP, on functional vocabulary because they're the ones that are teaching the reading and the content and the math. And you want to use that communication system during all of those things. You do not want it just to be under the speech and language. You want it across the board. It's so important that they use it all the time. And then that special education teacher works to both give me feedback and the OT feedback, and then also train the paraeducators. And then I'm in the outpatient setting currently, but I do the same thing with caregivers. If you have 2 nannies and a babysitter and a grandparent and a daycare provider, those people should be being trained with that. And so it kind of creates this top-down, bottom-up feedback loop. And that is what should be consistently measured and monitored, I think, to make sure there's progress. All right, Melissa.
Hi, Leslie. This is Maria, just giving you a friendly reminder that we're running low on time.
Perfect. Maria, do I have 5 minutes?
I'd say
3
another
minutes?
minute or two.
Perfect, because I only have 2 slides. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to let you all read this quote yourself, because it is basically just saying that there is lots of research in using this chosen communication system constantly. And if you're only doing it during speech therapy, that's not going to take. If you're only using it at school, that's not going to take. If you're only using it 30 minutes a day, it's not going to take. So these are the issues that I most frequently encounter. It needs to be, to achieve mastery, the child must be inundated with seeing that system being used frequently, interactively, and generatively. All right, Melissa. All right, so when do you ask for this? Oh my goodness, as soon as possible. So if your SLP, me, or your AAC specialist or primary provider has not initiated a plan, meaning you have an IEP, but you feel like this is just not crossing a home, it's not crossing a daycare, ask for help. And if you should receive help. It is my job to give you help. All right, Melissa. All right, so lastly, my other wordy slide, adding communication plan components to a legal document. I put some snap phrases in here that I thought that you could use when you are trying to make this more functional. So in Maryland, you could say to them, given that my child is nonverbal or minimally verbal and struggling with communication, I would like these components added to the IEP as a functional evidence-based approach. And where could that go? Definitely under assistive technology, definitely in speech and language goals, but I want it across the whole IEP and especially in supplementary aids and service. And I put a example. Now it's individual and it's gonna definitely depend on your child, but this is some language you could use when you go in. And I know that Paul is going to talk more about this. So I'm gonna, Melissa, have you switch that last slide to my examples. Perfect. All right. So ensuring generalization. I like to use this throughout the day. So again, it's not about sitting down for 30 minutes. It is about using your activities of daily living and then picking what's most motivating to your child and starting there. So if you YouTube natural aided language stimulation, you will get so many ideas. People reading books with it, people sitting with their child during toilet training, during family meals, during brushing their teeth, going on a bike ride. Those are the times that are really important. I can't say that enough. And I'm really proud of my families across the 9 months of teletherapy because they've really started living it. And that has helped the child be able to use their system. All right, Melissa. All right, so these are just examples that I had done in the clinic. I have done similar things in the school system in reverse, but this is just a way to actually take what the targets are with your specialist and then turn that into something functional for your child. And I would say that this has changed probably monthly to 2 months as the child starts to gain, participation with their communication system. So Melissa, if you want to switch to the last slide. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for letting me talk. Paul's going to talk more. Dr. Lavelli is going to talk more about IEP. And I think that this is such an important thing. So best of luck to you. And if you have any questions, please email me. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was wonderful. Really appreciate it. Our next panelist is Dr. Paul Lavelli. Paul, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm going to reiterate what Leslie said. I think one thing jumped out at me in her presentation is, any system that we develop, it's a child's voice, right? And we have to value that voice. So when she said, if we don't use the system that the kid uses, we're not valuing the voice. And I'm going to talk more about that, but I really want to think about that as saying everywhere this child goes, that's his voice. And nothing gets under my skin more to the child that we make carry around the system to lunch and he never uses it. And he carries it to the playground and he never uses it. And he only uses it for the 2 30-minute sessions that he has speech in a week. That's a waste of his time, right? And we're not in the business of doing that. And so I'm going to talk really, though, about from an educational consultant advocate hat of how to get this into the IEP. And Leslie brought up some of the ways to do that. But really, when I'm sitting at that IEP table with my family that I'm helping, I'm going to use the Leslies in the room as the expert, right? They're the speech pathologists. So I'm going to garner their help in getting the plan initiated. And so typically, if we sit at a table, they may come with 2 or 3 speech and language goals, right? And the real question that we ask the speech pathologist is, well, how are we ensuring that we're addressing these goals across the entire school day? 6 hours if you're in the school, but really more importantly, the 14 hours that the kid is awake, maybe more, right? And so I usually get that dumbfounded look, and then we sort of solve that problem. Well, that is through a functional communication plan. And so there's no box, as Leslie said, on the IEP for a functional communication plan. There's a box for an FBA and a BIP. There's a box for assistive technology. There's stuff under supplementary aids and services, but there's really not a box for a functional behavior plan. So we need to figure out how to get this incorporated. Now, some of the, as Leslie alluded to, sometimes it's done within the confines of a behavior intervention program, right? Because we're looking at communication is behavior, and we're looking at teaching communication skills. Sometimes it's done within the special considerations and supplementary aid and services that we're going to have a device. We may, if you're in Montgomery County, have an interact consult with their team. But again, that's not 6 hours a day or 14 hours a day, depending on how we're looking. So we're going to take those goals and we're going to ask ourselves, how can we incorporate this into a child's full day? And who's going to do it? Where is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? And most importantly, how are we going to take data on the progress when we use a system? So as I said, one of the things that tools that parents can use is get that into the prior written notice. When they ask that question and they get the look from the speech pathologist and the team starts to talk, really we want to outline, okay, who's going to develop the plan? What are going to be our targets? How are we going to take data on those targets? Who's going to take data on those targets? And when are we going to come back and talk about that data? And Leslie suggests monthly, and I wholeheartedly agree, right? So one of the things you're thinking at your IEP meeting, you can say, look, I want to have a team meeting with the OT, with the speech pathologist, with the special education teacher in 30 days to look at the initial data on the plan, right? That's a reasonable expectation. Now the team can say, well, we're not going to put that. Well, then you have the right as a family to call an IEP every 30 days. And believe me, they're not going to want to have a full IEP. They'll just have a team meeting with you about every 30 days. And it's totally reasonable. And I think it's important to remember, and it's certainly some stories that I tell, is that these are kids who come home from school and are not able to tell their parents how their day went, right? They're not able to tell their parents what went on in social studies. They're not able to tell their parents what went on in music. Who did I play with at lunch? What did I do during morning group? So there's an obligation for the team to have a communication system that works both with the child and with the family, so that we're making sure that these are targets that we can use and we can ask meaningful questions of the kids when they come home from school, right? And I find when these plans are really put in place, the challenge is not the plan itself. The challenge is actually keeping up with the kids. And Leslie can probably speak to this more, but kids exceed our expectations in terms of mastering these targets and moving on to new targets, right? That's the real challenge that I find is, okay, we just don't have enough vocabulary in the system. We need to build more vocabulary into the system. And I'm talking about, one of my favorite kids I ever worked with, Nick. Nick's pulling his mom's hand to the refrigerator to get a drink of milk. That's when I met Nick, right? 10 years later, Nick takes out a device. He scrolls through his device to his math folder. He hits math, then he's got algebra, geometry. He picks algebra, then he's got trigonometry, then he picks trigonometry, then he picks linear equations, and then he answers a question, right? That's how far he had come. And that didn't take place in 1 year. That took place over 10 years. But its system started out with, I'm going to use a gesture to get me a glass of milk. And now I'm using a system to respond to the curriculum, which is what really school is all about, right? So when we're thinking about bringing in this new system and making sure it works across all settings, we're calling that generalization, right? How are we going to generalize? And that's going to take consistency. And that's why Leslie talked a lot about having that plan and having everybody in that plan come together, work on that plan together, and be able to come back and talk about that plan and the progress of that plan. And in my experience, I find it's not the speech pathologist who's really your point person. And I mean no disrespect to speech pathologists, but I've seen their caseloads in the school and they can't be your point person. They just have too much on their plate, too many kids to work with. But I think your special education teacher really is your point person. And your special education teacher has access to the OT, has access to the speech pathologist, has access to the paraprofessionals, has access to the Interact team. So I'm thinking using really her or him to coordinate the services and making sure that they are sort of the case manager for that functional communication plan. They may not have the expertise to develop it, but they certainly have the expertise to make sure that we use the plan, we use it across environments, and that we use it across people. And that includes peers, right? Because when we're talking about using these plans and giving a voice to the child, the voice is also to interact with my peers. So the peers actually have to learn sometimes how to use a communication system to interact with the child that has autism, right? That's just common sense, right? I think those special education teachers who really have an understanding and work closely with their team, they are implementing those best practices. And they are the people who reach out to me or the family or to the speech pathologist and say, look, we're in a roadblock, right? We're doing math and I don't have the vocabulary on the core vocabulary board to actually have him answer questions. How are we going to fix that? And then we go to the speech pathologist and she comes up with a new way to do that. Or the special education teacher might have access to systems to generate those responses as well, right? But that's really what it's all about. Mom calls up the special education teacher, hey, we're going away for the weekend. We need a vocabulary. We're going to go to an amusement park. I don't have any vocabulary for that, and so that's a meaningful opportunity to start to expand this kid's vocabulary and have him find that voice really meaningful across all of his environments, right? So then that leads us sort of where the pitfalls are and where the challenges. The challenges are really getting that consistency and making sure that use of any functional communication plan or any system that we're using is not just during the 2 30-minute sessions. It's not just during lunch or snack time. It's all day long from the time the child gets up till the child goes to sleep, and even when he wakes up at night, right? And so I think when I'm trying to overcome these pitfalls, it's making sure that everybody really knows that we have to use this for everything that we do. And sometimes for us as caregivers, teachers, whatever role we're playing in a child's life, sometimes it's easier for us not to use a system, but that is a mistake, right? Because we're valuing that voice and we're making sure that given the opportunity to respond to some question or make an initiation or talk to a peer or make a joke, I'm going to use the system and I'm going to value that system, and I have access to the system and the vocabulary I need to accomplish what I want to accomplish. And that takes a lot of coordination and a lot of opportunities to meet, right? And as I said, when I go to these monthly meetings as an advocate for my families, it's not the child that's the barrier. It's the ability to keep up with the vocabulary that the child can access, because they tend to, once they find that this system works for them and they're not having to use gestures or other things to communicate and they're getting what they want, It's the real challenge is to be able to keep up with that vocabulary. And I think if you go to your IEP meeting and you ask those questions, and Leslie talked about a lot of those questions and language that I would use, and say, okay, how can I memorialize this in my IEP? Who's going to draw up the plan? Where is it going to be? When are we going to meet on the plan? Should we put that in the plan when we're going to meet every 30 days? Should we put it in the plan that we look at the vocabulary about every 60 days to make sure we're keeping up with that? All that becomes part of that plan, and you really become a collaborator with the team that's working to get this child a voice across his entire day or her entire day. And I know I'll probably have some questions, especially about advocacy, but I'll save those to the end so we can catch up. I'm good, Maria.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Paul. That was wonderful. All right. Well, Joy is our next panelist. And Joy, if you're ready, you can take it away. Joy, I think you're still on mute. There we go.
There we go. No, I was saying I'm not a PowerPoint person. I prefer the Q&A, so I'm gonna try to power through this really quickly so we can get to, like, you know, to get what you guys came for, any questions that you have. You can go to the next slide. That's basically the questions that I'll be answering. I'm Joy, by the way. I'm autistic. I was non-vocal until I was 12. So I am a behavior specialist. I'll be sitting for the BCBA exam very soon, and I'm working on my PhD in ABA. But today, I'm here as a member of the autism community. My concerns in this are more of, we are the consumers, meaning autistic people, and the problems that I've seen is in the field is we're not considered. So I'll be speaking from that perspective. So what should be considered in an ideal functional communication plan? It should play upon the individual's strengths and existing behavioral repertoire, allow the individual to be an active lead rather than being a passive recipient of services, meaning that we should always be involved whenever possible in these meetings, anytime you guys consider or talk about, you know, what methods are best for us. Existing behavioral repertoire, for instance, I was a co-ed when I was a child, and that is actually how I began to speak, that was shaped. I also like to watch credits, and people didn't decode the fact that I was actually kind of speaking. I thought I was communicating via my, you know, repeating stuff that I saw in credits, but nobody kind of decoded that. Recognize that vocal communication is not superior. And by that, I mean, just because somebody has the ability to speak doesn't always mean that's the best mode of communication for them. There was a point in my life where people knew that I could speak, but it just wasn't suitable for me because I have processing issues and a couple of sensory issues and OCD in terms of wanting to repeat words to make sure they sound perfect. So it would be counterproductive for me to speak, and it was easier for me to sign. Considering that even though an individual has the ability to seek alternative methods, may be more effective or appropriate, consider sensory preferences, aversions, cognitive processing issues, like I said before, and considers neurodiversity, meaning considering autistic culture, and not look at everything we do just because it's atypical as being like a problem, but actually build upon it like it's a strength. Next slide. I also think it's really important that you acknowledge and validate non-vocal verbal behaviors that are meaningful. To you, someone like jumping, for instance, could be a way of somebody communicating, and people are just not acknowledging it. I hear a lot of times people say, oh, we're working on meaningful communication. To you, what I'm doing may not be meaningful, but to me it is. And so to me, that's kind of like discounting me as a human being and my attempts to do so. So in shaping, you know, functional communication that everybody can understand, you need to acknowledge those attempts as well. Recognizing that vocalizations may not be appropriate, I already said that. And recognizing delay doesn't mean never. For me, there were stages and that built up to speaking. I'm 43, It took me until I was 12, and then I probably wasn't speaking well until I was in my 20s, but I got there. And it may not always be speaking. It may be just building up to, you know, fluent ASL or fluency with a device, but just knowing that, you know, progress can be made. And sometimes we just need a little bit more patience than the deadlines that are set, you know, for IEPs and so forth. You can go to the next slide, Maria. Where am I at? So disregarding existing non-vocal behaviors, which I spoke of before, which is communication attempts, classifying non-vocal verbal behavior that's not easily perceived by the neurotypical mind as not meaningful. I spoke about that. And holding this ability to speak as superior, confusing a lack of vocalizations as a lack of comprehension or intelligence. I know a lot of people say that they don't do that, but I've worked in schools, I've worked in clinics, and for some reason, when people don't have an actual like voice, people tend to forget that we're there and don't include us in conversations pertaining to our own, you know, issues. So I feel like when we're in these meetings that we should be addressed and involved as much as possible. Next slide, Maria. And again, this is just reviewing like everything that I said in the beginning. I want people to play on individual strengths and existing behavioral repertoire, meaning stuff that I'm already doing. You can shape that in the long run to make it, you know, to something big, but, you know, take advantage of those things and allow in us to be the active lead and recognizing that it's not superior. So all of those things that I, you know, talked about, I just really, really want to emphasize that we are the consumers. I am of the belief that parents are the experts. Professionals just help facilitate what you guys already know, because we know the approaches and we know the strategies, but you know what's best because you spend the most time with your child. Your child also knows if they have the ability to communicate in a way, and you guys have some type of way to talk about these things, but you know when something doesn't feel right. And I really think that parents should speak up if they think that a certain mode is not right for their child, or their child, you know, has expressed it to them, but, you know, people keep pushing it. We need to be more involved in what is done for us. And I also believe that parents should reach out and become involved with the autistic community. Listen to autistic adults and a lot of our experiences, because there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom that you can gain from listening to other people that were once like your child, what they've experienced. Not to discredit, you know, like professionals, because, you know, I'm a professional too, but you really have to look at these experiences, and that will also there's a lot of trauma that people are saying is causing quote unquote therapy, and that'll help prevent some of that too, by just listening and going with your gut and doing what you feel is right. Okay, Maria.
Is that the final slide?
Yeah, that was the final. I'm stuck at talking to myself.
No, that's wonderful. I just wanted to make sure. So first of all, thank you. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists, Leslie and Paul and Joy, for those very thoughtful presentations. Looks like we might have a few questions coming in through the chat, and Laura Gordon, our X-Minds board president, will monitor the chat and help out with the Q&A.
Yeah, so as we're going through this, just to remind everyone, please, you can enter your questions right now in the chat. If you've got questions, please go ahead and do that. And if we're discussing the question that you submitted and you want to sort of chime in a little bit while we're, whatever it is pertaining to your question, please just unmute yourself and we can do that. So the first question, which came early on for Leslie, is the Paul sort of touched on this, I think, as well. When a student has a device, should only the student be using the device to communicate, or should people around the student be using that device as, you know what I mean? Like how How does that work? And
you're asking whether who's going to get on a soapbox, me or Leslie first, but we're both going to say the same thing. Go ahead, Leslie.
So yeah, no, yes, people around the student should be modeling and talking with the device. Like recently, I've had siblings come in, which I've just loved, and had them go back and forth. Like, so they've got the device and the child is attending to the device, but the siblings talking and playing on it, and then the child is using it. There was, a school of thought probably 20-25 years ago where it was like, it's just the child's talker and no one else should touch it, like an ownership thing. But it is the child's voice, but the child is benefited just like we are by hearing that paired with the visual or whatever it is, paired with a gesture, and then using that throughout the day, as I said, and then Paul said as well.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a third grader I had worked with who had spent a large portion of the time playing on the corner of the playground until we got the device in her hands and we made a friend and we set it up, and she took out that device with her friend in the playground, and we had to break up the 30 kids around them at the end of the playground time because they were engaged in social interaction using that device, and you could see the smile on that kid's face was from ear to ear, like, and that's no adult contriving any social situation, right? That's the beauty of it.
I love that.
But that includes adults too, like how we can empower the adults to utilize it and model, right? Like, because I honestly, I have limited experience in the school system, but what I've seen is what you just mentioned, don't touch it, it's his. So this is awesome. Like what about like even, ordering lunch or in the cafeteria, like is all that an appropriate way to just get it done?
Yes, and that's what I was saying about in the schools where it sometimes fails, is that there's a plan, like a plan put, whether he said it's in the BIP or it's in the assistive technology, but then you want to have that observation and feedback. So I do want that child with his paraeducator in the cafeteria ordering lunch with it, and the cafeteria lady using it too, and having the people that are in the situation with them in the transitions are so important. Transitions between classes, using that, like Paul said, like on the playground with peers or in the hallways with peers, and then training the adults to really know, because it does seem, I always think it seems intuitive to sit and use it, but I have to tell you, I think some people find it daunting. They see the icons on it, or depending on the letter board or the text board or whatever you're using, modified signs, and they find it daunting, so they pull back, and they need that, I think, that little nudge to know that, hey, do it, just get on there and start doing it. And the more you do it, the more you're going to know where it is, and that's how you learn, and then that's how the child learns. So
I also feel like that gives us the same, you are coming to us the way we have to come to you. Like you having to do the same effort that we have to do, and that's only fair, because it's daunting to us to have to speak.
Yep.
So
yep, I agree.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. The next question was, can spelling to communicate be a functional communication system? Like, is that a thing? Like, is that something that you've seen work, and what are the pros and cons, and what are the different ways to make that work?
Laura, was that one for me or for all of us?
Whoever wants it.
Okay. Yes, spelling is definitely, I have children. I had an 18-year-old, it's a long time ago, in San Diego. He's probably like 35 now. He was so amazingly brilliant, but fully nonverbal. And he used just spelling and typing to communicate to me. He even had like a little computer where he would quickly type in and spell, and it would shoot out like a stream. And if I wanted his opinion on something, and he had amazing opinions on things, he used that to tell me what he wanted. So I definitely consider that its own form of communication, and children will often kind of lead me to it. So I have children that may have an AAC device or a program, but they're so good with spelling and letters, and that's how they learn. Like currently I have a patient in Kuwait who's actually doing Arabic and English with me, and the way that he has learned to speak is by doing the Arabic and writing, and then the English and writing on his keyboard. So yes,
I
I
think
definitely.
nowadays that's really generalizable. My daughter's 26. She's totally non-vocal. Her husband's totally non-vocal, but we text all the time. So it's the same thing. So in today's world, it makes her very, like nobody sees a difference in her because she texts, and when she's not texting, she'll just put it on her notes. So I think that's really easy. And she works a full-time job. He works. She has children. Her children read it. So it's generalizable.
Well, and I think it's really good for parents to hear that, because I think oftentimes in the schools we'd always try this first, or they need to be doing it this way. But like Leslie said, if the child is indicating that this is the way that works for them, I think like Joy said, parents should feel that power to say, can we just try this? Because if you know it works, then
and what Paul said is really applicable. Sadly, having come from the school system or multiple school systems and multiple different like clinics and hospitals, as speech language pathologist, where he was saying that your point person ends up being the special ed teacher a lot of times, which is true. We are so overloaded with our caseloads, but we have this so much to offer. So if you can get us to be able to help with that, and then train, because a lot of the paraeducators, the special ed teachers, the general ed teachers, they don't have that knowledge or training to know like spelling could be a thing, or using written language or like typing could be its own form of communication. They just don't have that understanding, but with training they do, and then they're able to embrace it, right? So
and if it's all right, I'd like just very briefly to chime in on this one question. I myself am the parent of a non-speaker, and we tried everything over the years, and what we eventually ended up trying spelling to communicate, and that actually is the method that has worked for our child. It's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's what she gravitates towards, and where she can express herself more meaningfully. So we're an example of having tried many things, and spelling to communicate is what's worked best for us. So, for what it's worth.
And Paul, did you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I just wanted to full disclosure. My daughters text each other while they're sitting next to each other in the back of the car. So how normal it is for kids to do that. And now, and I don't like to admit this, but I had to get Snapchat so I can communicate with my daughters by pictures. So it's so normal now just to be able to do that. And whether you have autism or not, so spelling, absolutely 100%.
Great. Okay. This is a question for Joy. The question was, do you find it's an assumption that kids who are nonverbal or minimally verbal don't understand things around them? And at what age did you realize that you were having a tough time communicating, or that people weren't understanding you, right? Like, when did you sort of realize, wait a minute, something's not happening?
I didn't speak at all, like, until I was 12. So it was like, it was always a given. But to me, okay, so people say one thing but do another. So people always say that they think that, don't think the person, but I think the point that we're so quiet because we don't have vocalizations, people forget that we're in the room, and then they say things and don't include us in things. And so you just overhearing things. And to be honest, that was my motivation to speak, is because I was always hearing people talk about me and what they were going to do with me. And I had no way, really, like, it was really frustrating.
Yeah.
When I was 12, I decided, I called it the fight for my life. And it was because the way that I heard things, it just sounded like everybody was going to be controlling me. So that's the whole reason why I came into the field, is because I feel like you have to remember that we are the consumers. So we should have a big part in this. Like the services, like whether people like it to say it like this or not, we are paying you. Like our parents are paying you to help us. So we should be the first person that you go to and try to communicate with and try to find out what's best, and acknowledge what we're already doing and help shape that into something that everybody can do. But 9 times out of 10, I come into a home and people are like, how are you communicating with them? Because these kids are communicating. People are just not listening with their eyes. They're listening with just their ears. Like, you have to really pay attention to what people are doing. And a lot of times it just requires you to decode it. Like I told you, I spoke through credits. I would script catering companies when I was hungry, but nobody took the time to realize, oh, she's watching credits all day long and she's talking about the catering companies, but now those are the things I pay attention to when you think somebody is scripting something nonsensical, pay attention to it, because sometimes it just requires you to think a little bit harder about decoding what they're really talking about. Because more often than not, we have a mode of communication. It's just nobody is listening. You know?
Totally. Yeah, exactly what you're saying.
I rarely meet anybody who doesn't understand, because later I'll find out, you know, like, look, I heard when you said this, and I'm like, oh, you know, like we may not look like we understand, because sometimes we're not, like, it looks like we're not there, but that's when I do the best paying attention. Like, my husband is always like, how do you have on 3 things at once? Like, that's just how I need extra sensory. That's why the PowerPoint was so hard for me. I need something running, and I need some type of something.
Yeah, and I've seen that for myself as well. My son is a scripter, and for me it was an easy, he for a while he would just pick things that started with P when he wanted pizza, right? He wouldn't say pizza, but he would say whatever, peppers, pickled peppers, and I'd say, do you want pizza? And he would not. Like, you know what I mean? It's those funny little things that you just have to start to know about your own child.
Happy birthday, and people always thought that I just liked the birthday song, but I was demanding for cake. Like, I like, whenever I sang happy birthday, that's when I wanted cake. I was a chubby kid, and I like cake.
Makes sense to me. All right. Let's go to the next one. And this one, I actually had a question about too, because someone asked about when a child, either a young child or even an older child, is reluctant to use the device. Sort of, what does that tell you? Does it tell you that the device is the problem? Should they be looking into anxiety around it? Should they be looking into a different method altogether? Like, what happens when there's a lot of resistance to using a method of communication that you're thinking, come on, I'm trying to give you a voice, and they're resisting? So I guess, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
To me,
anybody?
Laura?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So I experience this constantly, right? So that there could be resistance to the communication system that's been chosen. And I hate to say that there's intuition on top of experience after doing this so long. So finding a specialist or a speech language pathologist or an OT, an educational consultant, somebody that you trust, to really look at it with you. So what Joy said, I think that parents know their children. So even though I have all this experience, if they're saying, hey, I'm struggling with this, to pay attention and really go back to training them, observing, and then I have definitely changed communication systems. So if I'm using a certain, let's say the school system has put a child on a certain system, like let's say touch chat, and it's unmasked. And basically what unmasked means is that all the icons are out. And I try a few things first, like I mask them, I make the visual display, I work with the OT, I work with the other providers, and then I monitor that for a couple of months. But I have changed the system based on the fact that I feel like it's not taking. And if the child is resistant, I definitely need to do an analysis of whether are they resistant because they're not being provided enough opportunities to use it, and they're not sure how to use it, because it can be hard. A lot of children have motor planning difficulties, and in order to use a system, which is taken into account, you have to use motor, maybe index finger pointing, visual tracking left to right, and you want that communication system to play to their strengths, right? You don't want it to be so hard that they don't want to use it. So often that's like it's a complicated question, but I would say to make sure that your providers are analyzing the situation, observing, using intuition and listening to the parents. Like Maria just gave, her situation where they had tried many things, and her gut is telling her that this is taking for her daughter. So yeah. Paul and Joy, what you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say also when you're starting to introduce a system, it has to be useful. You better get a piece of cake if you were singing happy birthday prior, and then you give them an icon of cake, you better get a piece of cake at that point in time, because if it's not useful and meaningful initially, I'm not going to like the system. It's not, I'm better at using my whatever else to communicate than this thing that you're trying to get me to communicate. So I think that's real important, that it's very, very meaningful, and it gives high ticket items initially when you start to implement the system, right?
It can be overwhelming for us too, because there's so many words, and then navigating through, sometimes you have to press one thing to get to another word. So it gets frustrating, because it's like, I'm trying to get all of this out, and our brains are moving so fast that by the time we try to get that out, it's already gone. So you kind of lose what you're trying to say and trying to navigate through using it. And this is what my daughter has told me. So my daughter prefers to type because of that too. I didn't, of course, I'm old, so I didn't have a device. I just had ASL. But just from my perspective of trying to use one as an adult now, I'm like, it's you can't get it out quick enough sometimes, you know? So for me, I feel like sometimes you need to evaluate the sensory aspect of it as well. You know, like the sound of the voice, the way that the icons look, different things can be like very overstimulating that don't seem overstimulating to you, you know, could be overstimulating to us.
Yeah, those are all factors to take into account. And Paul's right. Sometimes there's resistance because too, you need to do a better job of providing motivation so the child knows what it is. Because if they're leading you somewhere and they're a little guy, it is easier to lead than to push something or type something or use a sign, right? And so you're providing that motivation. And then after doing due diligence, I think you probably make a decision with your team.
Okay. This next question is sort of related to Joy, what you were saying before, and it's I think maybe the decoding. The question was, you know, how to help a child 8 years old who was nonverbal is now talking, but in the moment seems to say things that are unrelated to whatever's happening, like singing a song that's unrelated to anything while in virtual classroom. I think this might be what you were talking about with the decoding, Joy, right? Sort of, if they're coming up with stuff that doesn't seem related to the moment, it might be related to the moment, and we're just not.
Yeah, but I'm gonna also say, and this is like, you know, you gotta remember, I've been in institutions since I was 3. I've been around thousands of autistic people. We often move ahead of people. Like, we're not at the same rate in the conversation. So sometimes we don't explain to you how we got to where we got, because I had to learn to do this. People will be like, what are you talking about? But in my mind, you should have known that domino effect of this meant this, but you didn't follow that. And I'm way ahead of you. So sometimes it's thinking, because that's my problem. It's hard for me to think sometimes. It's like the processing issue. So they could think that you understand because they're so advanced in the conversation. So sometimes you got to tell people to slow down, like back up. How did you get there? You know, because I really had to learn to do that. Because sometimes I would be way ahead of a conversation and people are like, how did you get to this point? And it's like, my mind is always racing and people don't realize it doesn't look like it, but there's a lot of effort to slow that down and kind of sync my brain with my mouth. Like it sounds weird, but it's really difficult, you know, and I have to reserve energy to do it.
Gotcha. And I think it also relates to that presuming competency. Like you said, your brain was, you know, and it jumped ahead to where everybody else was, like you were just saying. And what came out of your mouth made perfect sense to you. And I think that is a great assumption for all of us to make when we are trying to figure our kids out. Assume it makes sense to them. Assume that it does mean something. And I think that's a good way to approach it.
Just inquire more, like what, you know, what, and then you can get to, oh, I see how you arrived there, because it took me a long time to be able to do that. I would just assume people were tracking and people would not be tracking where I was going. And I would kind of be in these conversations by myself, but it's all of learning how to communicate with other people that have a different mind, you know, than you do, because we tend to understand each other. You know, it's kind of like, I speak a lot of different languages, but it's kind of like I think we have a strength for that, you know, kind of like what we lack in social skills, there's an energy that we can kind of detect within each other. And I know it's not empirical, it's nothing, you know, evidence-based, but it's just a feeling that I get that we kind of understand each other a little bit better.
Got it. All right, the next question is about writing versus typing. And this is something I personally have. My child is on the autism spectrum, and he has a horrific time writing. And so as a family, we decided that we would pursue typing as the thing, right? We're not going to focus on writing so much, but you also hear about how writing is so important for retaining information. But so as parents, I feel like we need to know, is it okay just to not do the writing? And can we just move on to typing? Because it's a struggle.
First,
I don't write.
I don't know about the other presenters, but if I meet one of my kiddos likes to write, he may not have autism. I just don't encounter a bunch of kids who have autism who like to write. It's the motor planning, the issues that go into that. Like, come on. And
let me tell parents too, like I have 2 masters, I'm working on my PhD, I never write. I carry an iPad with me that can make anything into a PDF document. This is not because of autism, it's because of OCD. I'm so weird about the way things look that I never am satisfied with the way it looks when I'm writing it. So it's counterproductive. I'll spend time erasing because it never looks perfect. So I type everything and I don't write anymore. Like even if I go to a job application, I ask them, can I scan it and make it into a PDF? Because it'll cause me to have a whole meltdown because it's just overwhelming for me.
I was just going to say, as I'm not an occupational therapist, but since I love them and I work with them so closely, there have been many times that the OT and I have made a decision with the family to just to go with typing rather than handwriting, because it is what Paul said, so laborious with motor planning, and that is a really common thing. So I wouldn't feel bad about that. Typing is now, like Joy said, we use it all the time anyway. So we've even made that decision at like 1st or 2nd grade sometimes with an OT, like in the school system or the outpatient, to just move forward with teaching that because it's so much faster for them. So and I guess it depends on the child, but that's just general.
I'm a straight shooter, as y'all probably could tell. I used to work for Anne Arundel Public Schools, and I used to always tell the teacher, I'd rather them do the work and show you that they can do the work. Because I'm not focusing on penmanship. Like, we just want to know that they understand and can comprehend. As long as they can do the work, I don't care if they can write, because I don't write either. So I know it can be done. Like, you can't tell me that you can't thrive and not write. So I'd rather sacrifice being able to comprehend and know and do the work than to focus on writing and have a meltdown. And that's another thing I just want to mention with eye contact too. I don't target eye contact if it's overwhelming to a person, because I'd rather you have a quality conversation and communicate with me than you try to please me by looking at me to make me think that you're paying attention. When if you know our minds, you would know that eye contact doesn't necessarily mean we're focusing, because we don't work the same way. And so I just wish a lot of more professionals would realize eye contact does not mean attention. For us, that's an overt thing that you cannot see. Like, and sometimes it means a lot of different things. So if it's very overwhelming, don't force people to stare at people in the eyes. I'd rather you talk to me and not look at me. My daughter does not make eye contact, and she works for University of Heidelberg in Germany. She's fine, and I know that it can be done. So I hate when people are like, they got to make eye contact. Somebody tried to make a kid look at me the other day, and I was like, don't make him look at me. I didn't ask that. Like,
that's a good point. That's a good point. Next question, and this is again something I've seen in schools myself. Why does it seem so hard to get schools to agree to pursue a tech device? Like, why the process always seems like, we've talked about this before at our X Minds discussions, just like at board meetings. Like, it feels like there should be just a checklist when a student enters special education and they are minimally verbal or non-speaking. Like, one of the first things on the checklist should be, should we consider a device? Or you know what I mean? Should we consider this, and this? But it seems like they make the child struggle for, you know, years before being like, oh, maybe we should, you know, do you think that's just the institutional, you know, just the problem with just the nature of the beast? Or why do you think it sometimes takes so long for that to happen?
Paul, you go first.
Yeah, I want to give parents some language to use during those initial meetings, because I think this is important, right? And I'm not saying whether Montgomery resists or not. What I'm saying is communication is the foundation to responding to curriculum, right? How, and we talked about this a little bit in my run through, but how does a child respond to the curriculum? That's the obligation of the school, right? And how is he or she going to get meaningful benefit? These are terms I want you to use. I want you to write this stuff down and use it at your next meeting. Meaningful benefit from accessing the curriculum without a way to respond and to communicate, right? It's impossible, right? It is the foundation of a kid being able to be at school. And after that, it's reading. And I don't care whether he can do math or not, because if he can't read, he's not going to be able to do math later on anyway, right? So like that's where you have to move your meeting and ask that question. And you're going to get a weird look from the teen. They're like, who's she talking to? Who's mom talking to now? Because the bottom line is they have to answer that question. And if there's not a system in place to meaningfully respond to the curriculum, the kid really isn't participating in school, and therefore it's not a meaningful benefit, and therefore I probably need something else, right? I'm sorry, Leslie, I jumped on the soapbox, but go ahead.
No, I love that. I totally agree with you. I was just going to be transparent and say that personally, after doing this a long time and being in the school system and, you know, California and Virginia and Ohio, I feel like, I hate to say that it's systemic, but I think it gets stuck in the bureaucracy of it. So my most recent experience is you always have the AAC specialist, who is usually a speech language pathologist. So it's someone just like me, and they're just in this role for the whole county. So that's one of the issues. They're usually for the whole county. There's usually a minimal amount of us doing it, like maybe max of 3 for the whole county and all these different children. And then the overloaded SLP at the site, she is supposed to be working with that person to get your child the device, but your special ed teacher is that primary provider, as Paul said, like that's your point person, right? So what I find is that the special education teacher often does not have any training in communication systems. I just met a SPED teacher that has 8 children, all on devices. And she honestly, she's been in on my telehealth session. She told me honestly, she's never had any training or any experience with communication systems. She's in charge of 8 nonverbal children. So, and of course, as soon as she told me that, I'm like, you're in here with me. We're training you. But like, I think it just gets lost in that bureaucracy. So if you have, you know, an overloaded SLP, but you have maybe an opinionated or experienced one like me, I will be verbal enough and advocating enough to say, hey, let's get this done. Right. Which I have done many times in the past. So I think it's about finding that one person, and it can be the OT, the SLP, the SPED teacher, sometimes even the principal, I hate to say, someone that you can say, hey, you're not listening to me. What Paul said, this child has no way to access their curriculum. And so moving through this very slow process it's such a slow process. It can feel like years if no one's there pushing. Even an outpatient speech pathologist, I have to tell you, as an outpatient, the past 2 years, I have pushed several counties to I've given them my data and gotten that child a device faster than if they had just spent time in the school system going through that whole process. So I think establishing a relationship can help, you know, saying, hey, I need help here. Where is my functional plan? Right. So
yeah. It's sad, but I mean, I live in Baltimore City, and I work with a lot of lower income Black families. And to me, I've seen a distinct difference in who gets devices and who doesn't, according to their social economic status and race. And it's like some people are just giving it automatically, and then other people are not, and they have to fight for it, but don't even know that they can fight for it at that either. You know, so then that's a problem when you're not savvy enough and don't know how to, you know, navigate through the system and don't have that assistance. But it shouldn't be like that. It should be like, you know, everybody gets the same fair treatment. You don't have to have those quote unquote high profile parents that everybody's afraid of, you know, because they label them like, oh, that's a high profile parent. They know what they're doing. You got to, no, you should give everybody the same treatment. You know, you shouldn't have to know to get access to it. And that's crazy to me, because I have people that I've just taken on that are 12 that should have probably had devices years and years ago and still have no form of communication. And how can you even be in school with that? That doesn't even make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. There is a definite unfairness in the system by the fact that that you have the quieter parents, or the parents that if there's no one advocating for you. And I definitely, the parents are still the best advocate. You know, after doing all these settings, you know, I have been many times the advocate pushing, you know, the school system to do something, but having that parent in there with me and both of us going after them to get that done is really helpful. So.
Yeah. Okay. The next question says it's for Paul, and it's something that Paul, we talked briefly about at the run through. Sort of, how do you, you know, you have your team at school, and you've never mentioned this idea. Maybe you've been with the team for a while. You've never mentioned this functional communication plan thing before. Is it best to sort of do the informal thing first and say, hey, look, I've been, you know, thinking that we should have a functional communication plan? Or is it something to just bring up at the IEP meeting? Or sort of what's the best way to get everybody to buy into this idea that, you know, it should be there?
It's a good question. So I'm a behaviorist, so I'm a manipulator by trade. So I do it by asking questions, right? And so when I'm at the IEP table, I ask the question, well, how is he able to respond to comprehension questions if he doesn't use words to speak? And then I get a lot of nods, just like you're nodding, right? And like,
yeah.
And then, well, is there anything we can do to fix that, right? And so I always find if you can make it seem like it was the IEP team's, as I'm an advocate, right? If I can make it seem like it was their idea, they're much more likely to implement it. It's just the way it works. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just, I'm a manipulator, so I try to get them to think it was their idea. But I ask those questions really about those goals and objectives, how they're taking data on those goals and objectives, what the prompting level is in those goals and objectives, right? So given, you know, let me give you an example. Given 3 verbal prompts and 1 gestural cue, he'll answer a who, what, and where question 4 out of 5 times, right? That's just, it's so meaningless, that goal. It's not measurable, it's not meaningful, it's not independent. And, you know, let's be honest, if we're really in the business of special education, we're trying to put ourselves out of business every day, right? We're trying to get the kid not to need me at the end. That's the only way the kid is self-regulated. So when I look at those goals and objectives and I'm working with a family, like that's where we might have to start, is that there's so much prompting within the goal and objectives that you're going to get this, and it's my least favorite line from the schools, making sufficient progress every single time. I get it 4 quarters in a row, making sufficient progress, making sufficient progress, making sufficient progress. He never masters the goal, by the way. He's just always making sufficient progress, right? That's because the goal was written poorly and wrong, and it's not created in a way. Now, if I take it back to a kid who doesn't have words to speak, like, how can he demonstrate his true independence in that goal? And that's where I start that conversation, which builds into, well, we really need to look at a system for him to be able to respond to the curriculum. It goes back to that. I'm using legal terms, right? Responding, accessing curriculum, meaningful benefit, all IDEA terms that are within the law, but trying to get it to think like it was their idea, not my idea or the family's idea.
And then
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was going to say, have either of you seen pushback, like from teams, or maybe Paul, you might get more than.
It's like, I don't know if I would have a job if there were pushbacks.
Right. But I mean, okay. How do you? I know, totally. But, you know, if you get pushback, if you say to them, you know, I really want this across all, you know, the entire day, across all disciplines, across all subjects, you know, when you get that pushback, I mean, do you see that a lot with this in particular? Like, no, we don't do that. Or, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Here's where I encounter the most pushback, and he's not safe enough with his behavior to use a sophisticated device, right? because he'll throw it. Right. I get that a lot, quite frankly. Right. And so, which is such erroneous thinking about behavior and communication. Right. That's just where, and I don't find pushback, because obviously in my role, I can make it very uncomfortable for an IEP team if I change the goals and objectives and he's not making progress anymore. Right. Because that's what I do. Then they're talking about more restrictive setting, increased costs of the system. And I know the game. Right. But so I know how to make it uncomfortable for this, and that's probably a way longer conversation we have an opportunity to talk about. But that's the resistance I get, is that we're not going to use a more sophisticated system because of his behavior. But I think behavior is behavior, and communication is behavior. Doing math is behavior. Using a device is behavior. And so if I don't have a voice to communicate, I use behavior, right? And so I think if you're looking at behavior just in isolation as just strictly maladaptive and not thinking of it in terms of functional communication, you're lost. And we get that pushback. And I never let that happen in my family. So I just don't do it.
I feel like sometimes safety is used as a cop-out, and it needs to be redefined. Like, are you inconvenienced or is it unsafe? So a lot of times I feel like people are using that safety as their inconvenience. And I'm real passionate about, since I've been back in America, because I've been in Germany for 10 years, come back to America and I see that they're putting kids on certificate route, like from kindergarten. And to me, that's also like a way that they've kind of like, oh, we don't really have to push that much because they're a certificate route. And I take that, I was certificate route. So I take that very personally, because I feel like you kind of just writing us off and saying we're not safe. And, so I kind of feel like the problem is we don't have the buy-in from the teachers a lot of times. And so they're not consistent with it, and they've already given up before they even tried. And that's a big root of the problem with those things.
I was just going to say, Laura, I think the original question too was like, why is it so hard to get this a communication plan that's functional embedded in the IEP? And like Paul as an advocate answered. So as I have been on the school side, I personally was sitting there, have had times where I'm just horrified by the what's going on behind the scenes of the resistance. But personally, that resistance is usually on the school end. Usually from their lack of training. Like it takes me sitting down, explaining to them what they're actually looking at for them to actually see it, so that they realize that they're not pushing back. Like for instance, they can push back on using the device all throughout the day for all the reasons that Joy and Paul said. And I find that comes from the fact that they don't really know how to use the system. So they're not really understanding that it's not about putting themselves out. It's about embedding it in the day, and then me helping and the other people in the team helping to actually train them. Like often the paraeducator can cause a whole plan to fail because they've got the child all day and then they're not carrying it over. Therefore, there's resistance from the other people who aren't trained because they're just watching it be a fail. Right? It looks to them as if it's a fail, but it actually needs to have other things change so that it can be successful. So that's what I've seen on my side. And as an advocate, or watching it from on the outpatient side, and watching it's very frustrating. And I have to say, there are teams that I've had that are amazing, that I've been on amazing teams. And then I have to say, there are some times when you just get some people that do not really care, unfortunately. And I can kind of tell who those people are, but by what they say, because if you're a speech pathologist, an occupational therapist, a behavioral specialist, or a special ed teacher, and you really are doing what you're passionate about, your goal is always all settings. I don't care if you're at school. If I'm a school speech pathologist, I'm always thinking about what they were doing at home. So, and now I'm in the outpatient setting, I'm still thinking about what they're doing at home and school. It doesn't really end. So that's where I think I go back to finding someone you trust too.
And I tell the truth. I don't care. I used to work for Anne Arundel County Public Schools. I was the person that you had to go through to approve somebody being in more restrictive environments. And I got so much pushback from people that didn't want to invest in the children. And I would pop up at schools and things would not be conducted with fidelity. I would get there. I just pop up. Where's the device? It's not even a device there, because they've already decided that it doesn't work, So unfortunately, you have to really be proactive and sometimes aggressive and really fight for these kids. I left that job in tears because I felt like, how can this be fixed? Like, this is crazy that people are just like, I've already met you. You don't know this person. This is our lives. Like, people don't realize this is really somebody's life. Like, what you do now depends on if they're going to be poor, if you know what's going to happen with their life. And I know what can happen. And people don't think about that. They begin to just run us through the mill. And if you don't want to do that, then don't be in that profession. So I take it really, really personally. But unfortunately, more often than not, the teachers, the paraeducators, and it's not the paraeducators' fault, because they don't have any specialized training. They don't know anything. And then, like, for me, I was over 32 different schools. So I didn't even have time, to like go and train everybody individually. So it's the broken system that you just have to be really persistent.
Yeah, but there is a lot of hope too, because if you do take the time and you've like listened to a panel like this and you're taking these discussions, then that you need to advocate. You need to come in and say the words that Paul said or that like I put in, and take what Joy said. And then, like, just like I said, I started telehealth with some of my parents. I was very frustrated seeing my parents not be able to of my patients be able to use their system. Well, they weren't not using the system because they didn't want to. They were not using the system because they hadn't been trained enough. And when I trained them enough and I said it in the right way, they're now doing it. So I never think of it as that they're just not listening to me. I sometimes think maybe I can say this a different way and spend a little more time with these people that aren't trained so that I can make a big difference in this child's life. So that's just all I have to say.
And Leslie is cool, y'all. I work with her at Children's Spot. She pretty good.
Good to know.
Thanks, Joy.
So we're running low on time. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Laura. I just was going to say exactly the same thing. It's about 8:32 right now. We still have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm not sure if folks have time to stay just a few extra minutes for maybe one or two more questions, or if we'd like to wrap up right now. So I defer to the panelists and to Laura on that.
I'm good.
Panelists,
I'm good. I have a few minutes.
Yeah.
I'm cool.
Okay. So one of the questions, probably it's just two more. Let's see, I lost my chat here. One of the questions was, is there any reason not to do a device and sign language? Like, is there any reason not to do more than one thing, basically? That was one of them. If I'm going first, I would say no. If I'm looking at the child as an individual, I sometimes have a child that has learned some basic signs and still uses those. And I will often mix systems. Like maybe I'm working on speech and they're emergent verbal and they have some basic signs. And then, if they're telling me more this way, I don't have to have them tell it to me on the device. So I mix systems because I'm trying to find what's best for that child. And I've never done the same thing twice in like 25 years. All children are different. So, okay. And the next question, I actually was sort of hinting at that with the question about why is it so hard to get a system, whether it be an AAC device or whatever spelling. The thought that there has to be prerequisite skills in order for a student to qualify for a communication system. And again, I've seen this firsthand in the schools and it always drove me insane. But what are your thoughts on that?
Paul, do you want to go on this one first?
Yeah, I think there doesn't. There's not a prerequisite skill to learning to communicate, right? So, I mean, I think our first important step is to get the kid to initiate, but most of the kids I meet are already initiating. They're just not using a system to do it. And that's all we do is transfer however they're using initiation to a system. And we make it very efficient, total communication and functional for them. And it works. There's big ticket items available at first, big pieces of cake, and then we move it to other more functional stuff. I mean, I don't think there's a prerequisite skill to learning to have a voice.
No, I think the getting stuck, I actually have seen them get stuck on it, getting stuck on the prerequisite skills. For instance, he needs to be picking up the picture of bubbles and handing it to me before I can give him a device so he can say, I want that. I think they're getting stuck, usually not the speech pathologist or the OT. I think it's usually someone, again, who has not had enough training, who does not know the research. Because a lot of times what they're finding is that a lot of the children aren't even looking at the iconography on the device. They are doing it just like we type. They're doing it by motor memory. And that does not require you bubbles. And I'm a person, I love picture exchange communication system and all those different systems. So sometimes you're doing those things to establish communicative intent, but there's no reason to stay to beat a dead horse on those prerequisites for 7 years while you hold off on giving a child a way to communicate. When I was in the school system, I advocated around that, like, hey, wait a second, we're not doing this any longer. You're giving that child something now. And then we've gotten it. And as an outpatient, I have tried to provide the data so that they have no reason to tell me that, because that's silly. So.
Okay. That's just what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
The last question is kind of specific, but it can be generalized. Someone has a 5th grader who's non-speaking, struggling mightily, a lot of aggressive stuff coming out. Is there, instead of depending on the Interact team to initiate, what can a parent say? Like, and Paul, you sort of spoke to this, they're not accessing the curriculum, but is there a good place to start? Like, in terms of, is there a device or a method that you have seen work pretty well most of the time, the first time around? I think the parent, they're trying to, trying to find out what to request from the school. Like, where do I start with this 5th grader? So it's not like it's not like a preschooler, it's a 5th grader, been in the system for a while. What's going to be the most effective, in your opinion, to start out with for someone who's obviously struggling a lot? And I don't know if you have any, it might obviously depends on the child, but is there?
Yeah, I think, Leslie might say the easiest device to use is a switch, right? But I don't know. This is a bigger question than that, I think, because, here's where I'm going to walk on thin ice when I start to say this, but if there's aggression involved and you have, what's the function of the aggression, right? And so if the aggression, let's say, is to get attention, then I need to be teaching communication and attention communication stuff. And that's going to drive what system I use, right? And so I think, and this is a very, I would be reluctant to give anybody advice on this specific without having the data in front of me. But I think I would fall back on, does the FBA look at, and the BIP look at communication too? I would think that's important, because I think anytime we have that type of behavior, you really have to take a look at what's the communication system. How does this kid get to express himself? And that's where, maybe I differ with the BCBAs of the world, where I'm really looking at holistically. I think they're so intertwined, you just can't separate out one from the other.
Yeah, and I would say it is really hard to give, because every child's different. So, but just thinking that way, I would say that as a speech language pathologist, I always look, like Joy talked about scripting. I always presume scripting has a communication intent, because, and I think of that first, and then I analyze it. So the same with behavior. What communicative purpose is it serving? And then what system? And you can be, I had a 19-year-old that came last year who had all kinds of a different system, and he really wasn't accessing it. And so I started it back even on like a yes and no for his kind of aggression that he had. And you know how fast he moved, just having a way to get his needs met, that within 3 months, he was back on his touch chat device and actually using it to say that he wanted to listen to his iPod shuffle and that he wanted to go on a car ride. And that's all it took, was just kind of reshifting his thought that, like, oh, okay, I've got another way to do it. So just even at 5th grade, it might be going back to just visual aids, but then quickly building up to something that's more capable for him to get his needs met. That's what I would say. So.
All right. Well, I think that's the last question. And just to remind everybody, we will be sending all the slides out. If Leslie, you indicated that it's okay to email you with questions and stuff. Okay. So, all right. And Maria, I will turn it back over to you.
Oh, no, that's great. I just want to say thank you so much to Leslie and Joy and Paul. This was fantastic. You shed a lot of light on this very important topic. So thank you so much for all you've done for us this evening. And to everyone who participated today, I really hope you have found this helpful. As Laura mentioned, please be on the lookout for an email with a link to to the recording of this presentation in the next couple of days. And finally, we hope to see you back for our next program on Wednesday, November 18th. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Do you need us for anything?
Nope, you're released.
All right.
Thank you, Joy.
You're welcome.